Our next speaker is Eric Verspoor. Eric worked for a number of years at the Pitlochry Laboratory and more recently at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and is going to talk to us about the River Carron. And I hope at the end of this I can add you to my list of favourite fish geneticists, in that you, I'm sure, will give us some very clear answers. Thank you.
Right. I wasn't originally going to give this talk. I hoped it would have been the biologist that was charged with doing the assessment, but because of circumstances, I've ended up being the most appropriate person. The biologist, Matt Carron, who's listed here, is in the audience, but just joined us a couple of months ago, and Bob Kindness, who's in the audience as well, is co-author on this. And I've basically been asked to oversee a scientific assessment of the Carron stocking program. I think we can't talk about stocking in Scotland without talking about the Carron. I think it comes up all the time. So, and for that reason, different people have different views on what the situation was, and the purpose of the project really was to look objectively at the evidence, to collect new evidence, and to come up with an evaluation. And I'm just going to give you a progress report. There's not an awful lot of answers here, but a progress report. So, look at this one. This makes me want to eat chocolate. Is this a convincing argument that eating more chocolate will win you a Nobel Prize? Well, I hope so. Is it a convincing argument that it won't? So the association that we have on the Carron is one that many of you will have seen, and it basically is the association of stocking with the recovery of the population on the Carron. And the red line here really shows the level of stocking effort, and here's the various stocking inputs that have been put in. I haven't gone to the recent years, but because this just makes the point. So is this a convincing argument that stocking will restore the salmon run in your river? Is it a convincing argument that it won't? That's basically where we're at this point in time. Associations don't prove causality, as a number of people have mentioned. Here we've got other correlations. Did you realize that the number of traffic fatalities in the United States is correlated with the number of lemons that are imported from Mexico? 0.97. Did you realize that the global temperature change has a bigger impact on U.S. postal rates than does carbon dioxide? Also, the more churches you have, the more bars you have. Or is it the more bars you have, the more churches you have? Well, in fact, it's the more population you have, the more bars you have, the more churches you have. So you really have to be very careful before you jump to conclusions. So, as I said, we have a project which aim is really to assess the existing data and information, gather some new information, what we can under the circumstances, and look at the actual impact of stocking, be it neutral, negative, positive, the effect on salmon abundance as indicated by catch statistics and electrofishing information, and decide whether it's in fact adequate, or are we going to end up with that old Scottish conclusion, unproven. But if it's unproven, we want to be clear that the situation is we really can't decide what the answer is. So the methodology is to review historical information, monitor contributions of contemporary stocking using molecular markers, assess historical character, conduct modeling assessments, assess the contribution of catch and release. A large number of little projects which will all feed into trying to address this question. So I'm going to talk about the river, historical stock levels, the collapse, postulated causes for that, management response, recovery, cause of the collapse, cause of the recovery, overview of the current work, and conclusions. The River Carron, for those of you who aren't familiar, is up here on the west coast of Scotland, just to the north of Skye. And it's a river that's about 15 to 17 kilometers long. Bob will correct me if it's bigger than that, but it's roughly about that size. This is what it looks at. It has upland areas. This is where it enters Loch Carron in the sea, and this is the main fishing parts of the river here. Historical stock levels, we have a few little tidbits here which suggest that the fishing was pretty good. This is Loch Dual, which is the loch in the middle of the river. They were aiming at sea trout, and they got 112 salmon as a bycatch in 3 days, or 3 visits. That's not too bad. Must have been pretty good. Here's the stock collapse. You can see we had a tremendous collapse here in the mid to late 90s. That was paralleled by a collapse in the sea trout stocks as well, though this is a more dramatic collapse rather. The postulated cause at the time, people were, of course, wondering what was going on, and they wanted to do something about it, as we all want to do when a salmon stock collapses. So, at that time, the assessment was that we basically had poor juvenile production due to poor egg deposition, which led to loss of smolt output, less returning adults in this cycle, and that it may well have been due to spates and washouts in the river. And this was supported also by electrofishing surveys, which showed that the juvenile abundance in the system was much lower than you might expect for a river like the Carron, which, if you see it, is actually pretty cracking juvenile habitat. So the management response was basically to increase the juvenile numbers through stocking, and Bob Kindness, as I said, who was here in the audience, initiated this program and basically has run it ever since. And as stocking programs go, it's an absolute cracking program. So this is the stocking efforts that's gone on from 1995 to 2009. Over almost 2 million individuals have been put into the system. The 5-year average for salmon, 2006 to 2010, it's recovered quite dramatically, as you can see here, to higher than it was here. And is this due to the stocking? Well, in 2012, we had 416, which was way up here. 2013, we're now down to 131. So what we have here is this recovery against a background of considerable natural variability, and there's a lot of factors in there. And we all know what the catch statistics, you could say there's lies, damn lies statistics and catch statistics. Well, in this case, I think these are pretty good quality catch statistics given the people who are involved in collecting it. So I think we've got something to work with here. So that's the stocking there relative to the recovery. Note, however, going back to these correlations, what we have here is this is the trend in stock components in the rod and line fisheries for the whole of Scotland from Marine Scotland's database. And what you do is line this up with the Carron information, and what you see is we have a population crash in the salmon and grilse components during this time as well. It coincides. So, do we have a crash that's associated with the river, compounded by a general crash associated with marine mortality? Quite possibly. It's certainly suggestive of that, but that needs to be explored in a robust manner. So what is the cause of the decline? What is the cause of the recovery and the increase that we're actually seeing? This excess here, is that something that stocking's doing? We're supplementing it and we're adding to that catch? And if so, what are the implications of that? Needs to be considered. So we want to investigate the cause of the collapse. There's different possibilities here. Jamie's mentioned a number in his case. Cyclical fluctuations, natural factors, marine mortality issues, freshwater mortality issues that are episodic and not regular. Basically, we know there's enough evidence to suggest that all of these things are possible, but the analyses to look for associations in the Carron to determine which of these is or is not actually involved in the decline and the restoration isn't clear at this point, and that's what we really need to look at. And we want to look at the cause of the recovery. Is the wild population has not recovered, but the catches are being sustained by the stocked fish? Is the wild population recovered on its own? Is it a bit of both, as Jamie's, the other hypothesis there, but it's facilitated by stocking, and now the stocking just makes a minor contribution? Or is the wild population recovered, but that we're compromising the long-term sustainability of that population by continuing to stock? An important question. None of these possibilities can be ruled out for the River Carron at this point, and we're gathering and assessing the evidence at the moment. We've done a number of studies on survival of stocked fish. Bob has been the one who's done all this work over a number of years. We've looked at recaptured rates of angled fish because, of course, if your catch statistics are going to go up if you have catch and release programs and you're catching the same fish over and over again. So that's been looked at. And we've also started to do some demographic model using a genetic demographic model that John Gilby, who's here, built as part of the Fisheries Research Service Marine Scotland Science Program. And we're looking at natural recovery here. Now, this is just one run of the model, which is built on the basis of the Gurnock burn population. It's been validated for that. It actually mimics the Gurnock burn population. So we looked at what the effect would be of having a 95% egg washout in the River Carron over a number of period of years. And what would you see happen? Well, if you have it happen 1 year, it has no impact on the population whatsoever. It's resilient. But if you go up to 5 years, you actually do see a decline here. And what you see is the number of spawners in the river goes down into the orders 10 to 20 fish for a number of years. And then after this particular episodic loss decreases or ceases, you actually have a restoration of the population. There's a very significant natural recovery potential. That's what the model is telling us based upon parameters of fish growth, survival rates, density-dependent factors, etc., all taken into account in this virtual population that's been developed. So we're going to look at genetic tagging of stocked fish. We're going to assess the proportions of stocked fish in the returning adults, in the smolts going out, and in the juveniles in the stream. Conclusions? None yet. Watch this space. It's a project that's just started, but we think we have the capacity to inform this debate very significantly. I think a lot of people will be interested in knowing what exactly is going on in the Carron. If we're getting it right, we want to know what we're getting right. If we're getting it wrong, we want to know that as well. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. Very interesting, but I regret I cannot yet add you to my list of favourite fish geneticists. Right. Thank you very much indeed to all the speakers for keeping pretty much to time. Eric in particular was within his time. Therefore, to be fair, a couple of specific questions for Eric before we open the general discussion. Who would like to lead? Can I just make a point there?
Yes.
Wouldn't it have been good if this experiment had been designed to allow assessment of the effect of the stocking program by marking all the fish? Or
yes,
having some other way of identifying the hatchery fish.
But as Steve said, you know, this was a program set up to address an issue at the time. It was never set up to be an experiment.
Oh, yes, it isn't. That's not so much a criticism, but we could have had the answer.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Had we done that.
But if we had before and after information and samples and things like that, it would make it a lot easier. So that's why I would recommend anybody starting a stocking program, absolutely collect your information before you start, your baseline demographics, baseline genetics, etc. Get it all right. We're doing a retrospective analysis. We're doing an analysis on the tail end of a program. That's why I'm quite up in the air as to exactly what we're going to be able to conclude from this. But I think we'll still get some pretty interesting stuff. The recapture rates or catching rates of angled fish are already quite interesting. I think there's some stuff there that other people don't have that's going to be really useful and inform this debate, etc. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions for Eric specifically?
Hi there. I'm Sean MacDonald, River Carron. Actually, that's me up on the screen. And the dogfish is a little bit better than I do. I think I'd just like to point out when we started the programme with Bob, I sacked myself as the fishery manager and put him in charge. I thought that was the best thing I should do. And our expectation when we started, going back to your first speaker, your good self, I think it was what were our expectations? It was 30 to 50 salmon, to get ourselves from about 5 salmon up to about 30 or 50. Now, we have 6,000 tonnes of farmed salmon in the inner loch, so our expectations were not very high. So we've been taken by surprise with the success and the success of our return of fish. So the next program for us, and this is why Eric is involved with us, is we're hoping to have from our hatchery, from our different batches, and I know on Sunday Bob stripped 100,000 or more eggs from our wild, not from our wild stock, from some of our brood stock. So we have 2 different types of brood stock. We've got a wild stock from the fish we caught up this year, and we will take the genetics from every female and male, and I'm hoping we will have batches that will go in at different stages, at the fed fry stage, at the par stage, maybe some at the smolt stage, and give a better picture in the future as to how we should target stocking, if we do any stocking, or if, as some people have been saying today, that the stocking is going to be detrimental to the fitness of the fish, we can look at that more carefully. But we've got to go out there and have a real crack at it before we can draw any conclusions, as Eric rightly has been saying. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond, Eric? Or?
No, I think Sean's clarified the situation very much, and I think it's a very good example of everybody working together to actually to learn something from this situation. It's very useful.
Paul, you had your hand up, I think. No?
No.
Sorry. Yes, sir.
Are there records about angler effort on the Carron, Eric, that you'll be able to take into consideration? Because I certainly remember there was discussion about angler effort pre-Bob's arrival and angler effort post-Bob's arrival, and that clearly has an effect on the catch data.
Yeah, there is information on angler effort, but the extent to which that information can be used in a quantitative fashion, I think, has yet to be determined. And that's really why, I left the conclusions, watch this space. At the moment, we're gathering together the information, we're evaluating the quality of the information, we're looking at how we can actually put together what we know and make sense of it. And I would be very uncomfortable prejudging that at this point in time.
Eric, could I just say one thing about that?
Sean?
We've actually done some recent work where we've tracked down Seymour people that were still alive that fished in the 80s. And one of the things I asked them is, what was the fishing effort? And they said, well, Sean, you forget that in those days, you didn't have the tracks that you have now up to the river. And we'd all take off in the morning, and there'd be at least 5 rods fishing. We were all there to fish because the house was in a poor state, the old lodge. So you only came to Newcastle to fish. So the fishing effort in those days, in the peak years of the 80s, when we had 2 years of having 122 salmon, and our average for fish caught on the fly was about 65, and our average for the last 5 years on Newcastle Beat, with a fishing effort of about maybe 60-70%, our average on the fly now is about 90, it's just short of 100. So there's probably a 40% increase on the fish caught on the fly compared to the 80s and the peak years, and the fishing effort is a little bit less. So we have been trying to gather that. That's quite recent information. We've been gathering that. And as Eric rightly says, you can't really use that. You can only ask people because and make a conclusion. But what I have in my office is all the old bookings of who were there, and they came every year, and they were all good fishermen, and they fished on the Dee and on the Spey, and they were successful fishermen, if that's any help.
Thank you very much. Can I open the discussion now, please, to all the papers from the session so far? Just to remind you, that includes Steve, Kyle, Jamie, and Eric. So any questions for any of them or any general points you wish to make? Right, Peter.
Thank you, David. Peter Hutchinson from NASCO. It's a question for Jamie Stevens, please. Jamie, you mentioned the utility, how useful the baseline data was that had been collected from the 2 projects, the SALC project and the previous project. To ensure its utility going forward, it was a huge effort to collect that data under the SALC project. to ensure its utility going forward, how much is required now to maintain it? Is further sampling required?
That's probably better answered by John. Do you want to answer that, John?
Data sets like that need refreshing every now and again, so we get more contemporary samples, so they match more likely the fish that are going to come back and get assigned. And we are collecting samples as we go. We're actually building a new baseline with a lot of new samples now using the new SNP markers, which gives us a bit better resolution. So we have the original data set, which is being refreshed with new samples on a sort of ad hoc basis, but new samples are being collected and rescreened with the new markers with higher resolution. So with the original Salsi set, we can assign fish at a sort of regional scale. So East Coast Scotland, Irish Sea, West Coast Scotland, West Coast Island. But with the new SNPs, we hope to be able to get to certainly river or even within river in some cases. And that's work's going on now in a number of labs, including Marine Scotland.
Peter, I would just add to that. There's a lot of work going on in the background to actually integrate these data sets without financial support because people see the value of doing so and they go out of their way. And in fact, the Salsi Merge project, which was officially over a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, you'll know better than me, we've actually met 3 times to continue to exploit and develop that database and make sure it gets out there and gets maximum use. And so there is a lot of will to see that, but we certainly do need more support than that in order to continue and evolve that database and make it even more useful for the purpose. And I think it's proved very useful.
Thank you. Can I widen the discussion a little with a challenge to Kyle? Wherever he is he here? Yep, good. Your comparison of catchments which had hatchery programs or stocking and those which hadn't, and the fact that there was no particular better catches on the hatchery ones, well, the stocked catchments presumably were deemed to have some problem, some issue, which would be depressing catches. So wouldn't you expect those catchments to have lower catches than those which were deemed to be generally healthy?
Yeah, it's a most unsatisfying analysis, but it's all we have, and that's why. Can I pull that up? And that's why hello? I don't think that's the case. Right. I think, sorry. What I want actually is a stock slide way down at the bottom here. Come on. Not the Daphnia slide. We'll get there. Shucks. Now, unfortunately, I have another slide where, so over here on the left is the total rod catch. And unfortunately, I don't have the slide where each of those observations, I think there's about 650 of them or something like that. And those are all the observations that went into the data set. And if I had the slide, about 70% of those would be black dots. Okay, and those are the stocked observations. We typically stock big catchments with lots of anglers. Often it's in response to a dam going in or something like that, in which case the habitat above that is taken out of the conservation limit. So the conservation limit accounts for both the area of the habitat and also the quality as far as elevation. That being said, it's a correlative analysis, and that's why it's supported by the annual analysis, which then asks, okay, ignore all of the other catchments. Look just at this catchment and only the stocked catchments for that matter, and ask, after controlling for interannual variation in marine survival, does the stocking effort correlate with the subsequent rod catch? And as we saw, it doesn't. And that's not to say it's not, the stocking isn't producing more adults. It's just to say that however many adults it is or isn't producing aren't improving rod catches as we detect them.
Okay, but were the stocking rates and levels arrived at in a manner which was aimed to answer that question? In other words, was it a properly controlled and designed experiment, or is it just looking at variation in stocking levels which happened for other reasons?
Yeah, it's 42 rivers that have been stocked since 95 to 2009. Some have been stocked to sort of, as you can see, 10% of the conservation limit, which is pretty high. 10% of the egg conservation limit in fry, you're doubling the number of fry. 1% of the conservation limit in smolts, you're doubling the number of smolts. So no, this is a convenient experiment where 42 rivers got stocked and 20 didn't.
Right. So 2/3 of the rivers roughly were stocked at some time. Right. Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Sorry, just to follow on from that, actually, just so I'm clear, because I think this is a really important point. I picked up on it when you were speaking. Am I right in saying what that correlation doesn't show is what would happen to those stocked rivers if they hadn't been stocked?
Well, to some degree it does, because we have, remember, these are catchment means. So over 15 years, we're saying, after we control for the area of habitat, the quality of habitat, interannual variation in marine survival, and region, so we're not comparing Devon streams to Northeast streams, so we control for all those things that we know influence the abundance of adult salmon, statistically, and then you ask, what is the residual catch? So those are stocked catchments, and those are non-stocked catchments. To your question, do we know what would happen if we stopped stocking there? No. Do we know what would happen if we started stocking there? No. We know that adding individuals to a population, by definition, reduces population growth rate. And we know that adding mismatched phenotypes does so more so. But for each individual river, your guess is as good as mine.
Sure, but I guess it's still, to David's point was, you're not going to stock a river that doesn't need it. You're not going to stock a river unless it's got a problem, and a river with a problem is going to show a depressed catch. So that, I just wanted to clarify that.
No, absolutely. If these weren't stocked, they could be up there, which is perfectly conceivable from the literature, or they could be down there, which is also perfectly conceivable from the literature.
More questions? Must be. In which case, can I make one point last? Yes. No, we've got a few minutes till tea break. But Jamie, a point about your observation that the chalk stream fish, which turned up in the Thames, may be doing so because they are somehow pre-adapted to Thames conditions. Well, those fish were just being caught in a trap close to the tidal limit. They hadn't had a chance yet to perform in any way, and indeed there is effectively no successful spawning in the Thames. So all those fish had done is had gone to the Thames. They weren't necessarily suited to it or not, and they were, of course, the closest rivers to the Thames.
They were indeed the closest rivers to the Thames.
So isn't it more likely, by
you're absolutely
razor
right.
or whatever, they are the most likely fish to turn up as strays?
They are the most likely fish to turn up, but they're close in as much as there's nothing else around there, but they're still quite a long way away.
Sure.
I can't. Well, we cannot be certain what those fish would have done, but fish could have come from more northerly areas and made a journey that wouldn't have been that much longer, because those chalk streams it's quite a distance between the chalk stream outlets and all the way around to the Thames. And you're right, we haven't controlled for that, but we won't know what those fish were going to do. But I still think it's telling that they that they were there. And as we saw from the Mersey example, proximity doesn't necessarily dictate which fish will enter.
No, but what is it that those fish from the chalk stream would have been looking for in the Thames, or identifying it? I suspect it tells us something even more interesting. That is that the stocks from the chalk stream rivers may be migrating down the North Sea and through the English Channel, which is something we've often wondered about, but it is very interesting. In which case, why don't they turn up in all the Sussex rivers? And the answer is because there's no young fish in the Sussex rivers to attract them in as decoys. But I won't labour that one. There's a question.
Historically been ruled out that there's no natural salmon production in the Thames at the moment. There's none.
There's nobody has seen any. There was, I think, one or two examples of spawning early on. Pete Goff, where are you? Here you are, right. Pete knows this subject much better than I do. I think certainly in the peak years there was no evidence of a completed life cycle, was there? Right, so no young fish apparently produced by wild spawning. And as far as I know, that's still the case.
It's a question for Kyle. Kyle, did you take the chance to look at any sea trout catch data whilst you were looking at the salmon? Because that could have shed some light on the question earlier about whether you could isolate whether stocking was impacting on.
With great shame, the weeks/months I spent getting these data into a workable fashion, I ignored old ST. And were I not so daft, I would have them in the exact same spreadsheet with all of the habitat data. So that's for a grad student next year. And then we can look at this, and we've got 4 more years of data as well. So we will be able to look at sea trout and salmon. My guess is salmon conservation limits might match pretty closely with sea trout. I don't know. But it'll depend on the location of the catchment, the size of the main stem. But if you control for other stuff, I don't know. But it will be interesting to see whether they're positively or negatively correlated, and that comparison in particular.